Oliver North. Despite all their money and friends of convenience like Alvarez and D'Abuson, the Americans just weren't doing too well with their wars in Central America. Early on, it was clear to most in the CIA that I was not willing to help the Contras. Nevertheless, the Americans had for years come to me for help and advice, and when things started going badly for them in Central America, they tried it again. The initiative came from the man known as the greatest of the true believers, Oliver North. In North's view, I was no different from men like Alvarez or D'Abuson, mere operatives who did his dirty work. North was a user of men. He would be the one to find friends of convenience, pay them off, and discard them when their work was done. Like Alvarez, he also wanted to be the conqueror on a white horse. He wanted to be an American hero. While I had 2 meetings of note with Oliver North, and I could see that he was indeed the brash, self-assured man people now know him to be, I had no idea at the time of the scope of his enterprise. I had to assume that the impetus for him searching me out came from the White House and CIA men I had dealt with over the years. His first overture developed under unexpected circumstances. In 1985, Lieutenant General Robert Schweitzer, the director of the Inter-American Defense College in Washington, D.C., invited me to the institution's commencement address. The college brought in officers from Latin American militaries throughout the hemisphere, excluding Cuba, of course. The officers study and attend lectures for an entire term. This was the second time I had given a speech at the college, and it was a pleasure to do so. I thanked the general for his invitation, went to the commencement, gave my speech, sat through some formalities, and went to a brief reception. This was all followed by an evening event, a gala party on a ship cruising the Potomac. I was standing on the deck with a colleague when General Schweitzer called me aside. "General Noriega, I'd like you to meet a colleague of ours, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the United States Marine Corps," Schweitzer said, excusing himself politely after the introduction so North and I could talk. I was surprised by the introduction and by North's presence, since I didn't think he had anything to do with the college staff. That was true, he said. He had heard that I would be attending this evening cruise, and had sought out an invitation especially for the purpose of meeting me. North may not have remembered, but I had met him several other times. In 1983, when he had accompanied Bush, and another time the same year when he had traveled to El Salvador with then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. On that occasion, I remember that the head of the U.S. Southern Command, General John Galvin, and I had agreed that we would give Weinberger the opportunity, as an old soldier from World War II, to review the troops. Weinberger had been touched by the gesture and reacted emotionally to the opportunity. One other point, Weinberger apparently had been accompanied by another aide whom I just can't remember seeing, Colin Powell. If he had been there, Powell was far in the background, although he said in his autobiography that at this courtesy visit, at which we didn't exchange a word and at which I was paying honors to his chief, that I was evil. North got down to business. He described himself as being at the helm of the Contra supply effort. "We're in a war here, General. My orders come directly from President Reagan and Vice President Bush," he said, emphasizing his important central role in all of this. North had apparently gotten to the cruise ship sometime before I did, and he was many drinks ahead of me. It had made him loose and talkative. It was evident that he wanted to leave me with the impression that he was not just any lieutenant colonel, but a special one, a man who even had the ability to give commands and do things that men of higher rank, even generals, could not do. He made references to needing to get to know me, to having heard about my good work for the United States, and talked about how he was having problems in Miami because of allegations that people working for him on behalf of the Contras were also flying drugs. He spoke for a while like that, insisting that we would get to know each other. He was quite insistent and said that he would keep in contact with me and also with the Panamanian military attaché, who was standing nearby. I didn't say much, listened politely, and after a while we broke off. That was that. The whole thing left me a bit surprised. His brashness, his having sought me out, and I was wondering whether the whole thing was the word of a braggart who had had one drink more than he should have. I brought up the matter in passing at a meeting during the same U.S. visit with William Casey at CIA headquarters. "Is it true what North says about his work with the Contras?" "Oh, yes," said Casey. "It's true. North is who he says he is." I had no direct contact with North for a year or more after that. Then he approached me for help. In the summer of 1986, I got a call from Joaquin Quinones, a Cuban-American who would contact me on behalf of the National Security Council. I had met Quinones through Pigua Cordobes, a Panamanian businessman. He was a political ally of Bush, a diplomat of some kind who had sought unsuccessfully the post of U.S. ambassador to Panama. Quinones was represented to me as a messenger from the White House. At our first encounter, he had said that he was impressed by our military forces and that Vice President Bush was very much interested in Panama. Quinones, like North and all the other envoys I met, told me that Bush was handling the Contras business directly. Sometime afterward, Quinones came to Panama for a visit. He told me that Oliver North was visiting Iran and Israel and would be interested in meeting with me. They knew that I had a trip scheduled to Europe, so they suggested that North meet me on his return leg in England. I said that I had no problem meeting with him. The meeting was at the Victoria Gardens, a hotel I was staying at close to the Panamanian embassy. I was accompanied by a young diplomat assigned to the embassy, named Jorge Constantino. I remember that we got together with the Americans at the left side of the lobby, toward the rear. There's a kind of alcove where they serve coffee. It's an isolated and private spot where you feel like you're in a room by yourself. I recognized North easily from our previous meeting in Washington. He was disheveled, as were the men who accompanied him. He had the look of someone who had been traveling all night. He hadn't shaved, and you could tell from his breath that he had been drinking. Richard Seckert and John Singlob were there too. They were both retired military men whom I hadn't met before, but whom I recognized later when the Iran-Contra scandal unfolded. Singlob, I recall, described himself as chief of operations for the team. He gave me his card. Both men also looked unkempt. Their clothing had the creased look of people who had been on the road. I did have some forewarning of what this was all about, thanks to Mike Harari, my Israeli contact, a former Mossad officer based in Panama City. Harari had given me a general briefing about what they were up to, that they had been on a mission to the Middle East, including Iran. There was a story of a ship that had left Israel supposedly carrying food or candy or some nonsense like that. Of course, it was really carrying weapons to Iran. I knew the possible reasons for this meeting after my previous contact with North. At the time, the U.S. Congress was ready to stop any covert operation that cost too much, took too long, or in which Americans were liable to be killed. What the American government needed were intermediates who could handle clandestine operations on their behalf. I am convinced that these were not freelance operations. Both Bush and Reagan were always completely tuned into and briefed on what was going on. Everything was handled at a distance by men like Dwayne Dewey Claridge, who was the CIA regional chief for Latin America. Along with North, John Poindexter, Nestor Sanchez, and others at the National Security Council, these men promoted a clear Reagan administration policy. The underlings always made sure to tell me they were asking for my help in the name of President Reagan or in the name of President Bush. The president, they would say, has authorized us to start supporting the military against the guerrillas in El Salvador and to launch attacks against Nicaragua. The problem for them was we never agreed to participate in any of it. Quinones was also there, acting as translator. The atmosphere was quite cordial and respectful. North had a matter-of-fact, no-nonsense way of talking. He got right to the point, addressing me with the professional air of one military man speaking to another. He said he was worried that the Contras were not showing much combat ability, and the United States was having trouble providing them with economic aid. It was time for Panama to take a leading role in supporting the Contras, he said. In return, there will be a clean slate. We'll forget about all the bad stuff we've heard, he said, referring to the political charges being planted in Washington by Panamanian opposition leaders. We'll just forget about it. He made it sound like he was offering Christmas presents to an obedient child. He said he wanted us to set up a commando operation to plant bombs, mine Nicaraguan harbors. What we need is a few spectacular acts of sabotage. I remember Quinones translating the words spectacular and sabotage. Sabotage, sabotage, sabotage. He repeated it more than once. He took out a piece of paper with a laundry list of things he wanted done. Blowing up high-tension lines, acts of terrorism in Managua, mining the harbor, and he cast the Panamanian military as his last hope. He had nothing else. The Contras had not been able to do anything. There's money in it for you and for Panama, he kept saying. Money to develop military projects, for more weapons, for whatever you need. I thought North's proposal was ridiculous and never even considered it, not even for an instant. Look, the answer is that we just can't do this, I said. I think you should face reality. The Contras have lost their opportunity, if they ever had one. The capacity of the Sandinista forces has grown, and they are far superior in strategy and defensive posture. They have learned very fast. Their tactics are from the Soviet military, essentially a Soviet defense. North betrayed no particular emotion as I analyzed the military situation, but his interest was piqued by my mention of the Russians. I need to get more information about this so I can pass it on, he said. Give me an analysis and make it a good one. Explain everything you told me about the Contras and the Sandinistas and the Soviet defense doctrine. I need to show something like that to Reagan and Bush, at least, because I'm responsible for what is happening. He seemed to be taking what I had to say in terms of one military man talking to another. His attitude appeared to be, okay, you're not helping me on the ground, but we need a good military analysis of the situation. We need your expertise. This is the first time I've heard this. I sent the document to him through Quinones, and I remember hearing no more about it until the discovery of the Contra scandal. Quinones called me to say that the report was among the documents shredded in North's office. It was a more detailed version of what I said just a few months later in Tokyo before a group of diplomats attending a meeting of the Japan-Panama Friendship Association. In a carefully worded rebuke of U.S. policy, I said that we supported a regional settlement to the civil wars of Central America. We face the undeniable fact that the political and military crisis in Central America is being prolonged, and along with it, the economic crisis of the region is growing more acute, I said. And the insistence on a strictly military solution undermines social programs because the more that is spent on arms, there are fewer economic resources for hospitals, schools, low-cost housing, and highways. In reality, what is happening in Central America, casting aside all literary adornments to explain it, is that the region is simply becoming an experimental battlefield for new military doctrines and concepts. It was evident from everything I knew and from what was confirmed by meeting with him that North was trying to juggle 100 chess pieces to try to make the Contra and Iran deals work. I only knew about one piece: me. I think he and his confidants, men who also included Elliott Abrams, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, and John Poindexter, were grasping for anything that would work. The Contras were not making any progress. The Honduras front was too visible and weak. The southern front was collapsing. There was limited money to finance the war. Perhaps Panama could make the difference. And when I refused, one has to conclude that the real reaction was vindictive, angry, filled with calls for revenge against the pawn who wouldn't play along. North pretended to his superiors that I was the one who had sought this meeting, that I was the one who offered to infiltrate Nicaragua and take up arms. Just before North's unsuccessful 1994 campaign for the U.S. Senate in Virginia, I broke my silence with the news media and was interviewed about this subject on television in the United States. I repeated the story and told everything I knew. I am certain that my words helped him lose.